Hey everyone, thanks for joining Brandon Cruz, myself, Jeff Black, for another episode of Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. Today, we have the long awaited Metabolic Adaptation Masterclass. It is super sweet. Brandon sent me over some studies to kind of look at, which I, of course, am always going to let him take the lead on and then pepper in my questions along the way to seal up stuff as usual. But it's going to be really good. It's some of the most in-depth stuff that I really got to read, like the studies, like that. My eyes crisscrossed reading them. But before we kind of get into all that, let's go over how our last week's been. Brandon, you didn't have much excitement in your wheelhouse the last 7 days, sir.
No, I've been under the weather, as I had let you know. I've been kind of off the radar. Usually you and I, we communicate all week, but this past week, man, I was down and out, just under the weather. But at the same time, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. But with that, I had a lot of new client inquiries, and I worked on programming pretty much from Thursday all the way through Sunday. I've been able to take on some new mentorship clients as well as coaching, one-on-one coaching clients. So that's been really good. I kicked off, I'm also now mentoring and coaching one of my guys, Jeremiah Baer, who has a very good podcast that I've been on, Living Lean. So I'm excited. I got a good group of athletes. I also have some competitors that are coming up that they're next week will be competing. So I'm excited for that. We're kicking it off with a show down in Jersey, and then we will be going into shows in the New York region, because in my area, I'm from the Northeast, showtime from late July all the way through the end of August into like the North Americans type, time period is really, really, busy. So it's going to be every weekend, me having multiple competitors there. So I'm excited for that. That is something, I've competed 15 times over the years. It's something that I really miss. And it was something that I had to make a decision years ago. And Jeff, you and I have had this conversation. I was in a point in my life where I was like, am I going to keep competing? I'm on the national scene. I'm competitive. I was top 7 one year, top 5, I was top 7, top 10, multiple times. And, but it was a huge commitment, as you very well know. And it was something that I decided, I actually like the coaching aspect more than I like the competing. I love the process of getting ready and prepping. And, right now I've been informing the audience, I am in a dieting phase right now for photo shoots because I still do that professionally. However, I don't have I love the process of dieting, pushing myself, going past the exhaustion, really embracing the suffering and really overcoming struggles that come along with it. I just feel like it's been a great process, which has allowed me to level up and build and develop myself both physically in terms of my body, but also mentally, because it allows you to be able to see your limits, both physically and mentally. But I've gotten to the point where I really enjoy helping others and really helping them, optimize their process and really have a better, approach to dieting, not only from a physiological perspective, so dealing with metabolic adaptation and some of the things that we will speak to today, but also reframing their mindset around dieting, because dieting is so psychological and a lot of people overlook that. Your mindset towards dieting is, especially in a fat loss phase, when you are calorically restricted, a lot of people suffer more from mental restriction than they actually do from caloric and energy restriction. You know what I mean? Because they don't have a good outlook, or they don't have a good perspective on the process. They're majoring in the minors, and they're magnifying all the negatives rather than the positives, the productivity benefits that they have, the ability to see progress on a daily basis. They're looking at all the little things, like the things in their physique that they don't like, the fluctuations in the scale that annoy them, the lack of energy at times, the lethargia, instead of really looking at, this is a blessing. Like, we get the opportunity, like every day that I diet, and when I don't feel well and I'm up at 3:30 in the morning and I feel like shit and I don't want to go do my fasted walk, I always remind myself, I'm blessed to be able to do this. I'm someone in a capable body. I'm able to push myself. I'm able to push for progress. And this is something I decide to do. I get to do this. I don't have to do any of this. And I really try to ingrain that and really get that across to my athletes, whether they're IFBB professionals where they get paid for this, or they're just amateurs that are going through their first or second prep. So I really enjoy this part of the season, the part of the summer, when I'm having a lot of athletes. I'm really able to make a big impact on them, both physically and mentally, and really reshape their mindset towards the sport, because I have been through it all. I've had great preps and I've had terrible preps. I've had coaches that have buried me in a prep and made me really hate the process. And then I've had others that have enlightened me to the benefits of the process. And I really tried to be in that latter camp of coaches that really, try to enlighten their clients and really have them look at the good things about this and really make the most out of it and benefit and reap the most benefits from the process as possible. So this is a part of the summer that I always look forward to. So I'm just looking forward to getting it started.
Yeah, I always tell my clients, I'm like, it's a privilege to go through this suffering. Like, you live in a world where you can eat whenever you want. You have the means
to go through this suffering.
Yeah, I know. And I'm like, and those last few weeks when you're just really hungry and like wake up in the middle of the night, pouring in sweat, your BG's dumping and everything, bottomed out. And all you have to do is just go down to the fridge and eat, but you can't, and you start thinking
you can't, you choose not to.
Well, yeah,
I never see it as a can't or I can or I can't. It's I won't.
I look at it more like it makes me realize how lucky my life is, because there's a lot of people who don't get that option to be able to have food given to them at all times. So yeah, that's a really good point, man. I'm glad you frame it for people that way.
Absolutely. So how was your week, my man? Tell me about it.
Let's see. Work's been good. Clients been pretty steady. I've held a pretty good book. So if I lose one, I gain one or two. It seems to kind of be the way it is, and I'm very happy with that. I'm running around right around 100 clients, and that's where I like to be. And, but that's also in person and online.
Yeah. So I do want you actually, I had a conversation with, one of the coaches over from Australia that I'm friends with. I've been on their podcast. I do want you to, maybe elaborate a little bit on that with the 100 clients, because people hear that. And I am an online coach full-time now. And I know that I could not handle 100 online clients.
Dude, I know how some of them handle like 200 that I've heard.
Yeah,
I'm like, holy shit.
Hear that, sometimes we hear these coaches and they put out their number of their roster, and it's almost like a badge of honor. And when I hear that, knowing the effort, the time, and the attention to detail that I put into my programming, into my client check-ins, the elaborate, email correspondence, or the messages, or the Skypes, or the Zooms, or whatever I do with them, I know how time consuming it is. So maybe expand on that, because I know what you do. So when you say 100 clients, I don't kind of like, skirt back, but this is a combination of both your in-person that are in your gym that you own, as well as online. So definitely differentiate that.
So I'm probably about like 60-40 now, online, in person. So I got more online than I do in person. That's by design. I've got an assistant coach who helps me in the afternoon, but I run small group training. So I've got like 5 to 6 people per hour, just setting them up, going along. I partner them up with people and things like that. And, when you have in person, you're able to talk to them. So a lot of the stuff that you get text messages over, or phone calls or Skypes or anything like that, I get to clear out during the week. So when they check in with me, they literally only have to send their tracker, and I just look at what the data is. I kind of already know, and it's an easy change. And then the online stuff, that takes a couple of hours every week when I go through that. What you're saying is true. I do think that you have to ask yourself at a certain point, and I've said this on other podcasts, I think the biggest barrier to growth of the personal training industry in regards to what you can handle as coaches, the mental capacity that coaches can handle from the emotional distribution that clients put upon them. Meaning,
a lot of people don't realize that we are not just a coach. We are not just programming. I always say coaching goes way beyond the X's and O's of nutrition in terms of macros and calories and sets and reps of training in the gym. We are a psychological counselor. We are a confidant. We are a mentor. I just received an email right before I got here, and it was how I was an emotional support structure for this client. She was thanking me that I've been a mentor to her, both in business and in life, as well as within her physique. And a lot of people don't realize that, because they have had such bad experience with coaches that they only do macro updates. They're just macro manipulators.
Yeah. Well, I call myself like emotional support animal. You know what I mean? Like pet me when you need me type deal. But I do agree with that. I think that the issue I think in the space is people call themselves a coach, but they don't really know what coaching is. Coaching is leading through permission. Training is leading through position. And I talked about that when I presented on it at the PEC back in Dallas, which a lot of people wanted me to do. And I'm actually going to present on that in iLead very soon. But I think where people get caught up into this is most people actually, when identify like It Works, Advocare, people like that as coaches and trainers, and we're not that. So you already have to like bust through that. But when those people see that, like, oh shit, this person actually sent me a message out of the blue to be like, hey, how was your weekend? I know you've been struggling with some binges on the weekend. Did you win the weekend? Yes, I did. Like it changes the narrative. And that's what I mean by leading through permission. You're getting people to follow you because they have faith in you and they believe in you. I think this industry has a long way to go with that, in my opinion. It's one of the biggest barriers to, I think, what allows coaches to scale to the ability they need to. I'm really good in my area of leadership and helping people understand their autonomy and helping people understand the ability to believe in themselves above all else. But beyond that, dude, with work, I hope that explained that pretty well. How I do my clients.
I know personally, so I only
you've seen it.
I only want to position you to be able to explain it. I've seen how you run your business. I've been fortunate enough to see kind of like the inner workings of things. However, I do know that there's other people within the space that will hear you say 100 clients and they'll extrapolate that for what it is. And they'll think it's just 100. He must be just throwing these like cookie cutter emails and programs out. And it's a little bit different. And I will say, because I can relate to you on the fact that I actually started my business online in 2013 out of a gym. So I was an in-person trainer. I was transitioning into full-time within the supplement industry, and I was going to be going on the road. So at that point, I was working in the supplement industry. However, I was in an office position where I divided my time between morning sessions and evening sessions in a gym training, clients in person, as well as going to a corporate job. And then they put me on a road position where I traveled for a good 5-year stint for about 65 to 75,000 miles a year. And I realized there was no option. There was no coming in the mornings or going out at night. Like, I didn't have this time scale where I could give clients these preset times that I would automatically, or I would always be available. And I didn't want to cancel on them. So I transitioned to online coaching as a result. However, when I first started, my online coaching was mostly that they would come and check in with me in person. I would look at them up and down in person. I would get their feedback. I would see their, I would be able to read their body language because we were speaking in person. And then all I would do is the updates and send them over via email. And that's how I started. And I understand that aspect of coaching, because that's how I started. Because I'm sure you remember 2013, very few people were online coaching. So it wasn't like people were doing it fully online, where it was like they were coaching people that they didn't know, that they hadn't met in person, that they never saw in a gym. The majority of my early clients were all people that I either knew personally or that they were referrals from other local gyms or other, I initially only started working with people in the New Jersey and New York area because that's where I worked. And so then I expanded on as the years went on. But initially I was doing half in person, half online, very similar to what you do.
Yeah, I actually love it. I think it makes me a better online coach. And I think it keeps me less depressed. And I tell everybody that you're really good about going outside, getting your steps and things like that. But I know a lot of coaches who don't have any socialized. They literally are home. It's literally it's like gym home. And I'm like, that's a form of depression. You're stuck in a very simple loop.
The ones that I really have a hard time, because I understand the productivity aspect because they're so productive in what they do. But I do know a couple online coaches that they literally have a home gym.
Yep.
They get all their groceries delivered and they also work online exclusively. So it's like, what interaction do you have? It's got to be a little bit of an isolating situation. That's why even, if I get the opportunity, like, when I've went to the PC, I have clients that fly out and meet me. I have mentees that fly out and meet me. I have some of my closer clients that live within the tri-state area. They'll come and drive and meet with me. I have a client coming 2 weekends from now for the weekend so that we could train together. We can get some in-person sessions. I'll train him in person. So I have that interaction with clients. And then I also have interaction with those, I obviously recently relocated near my family. So I see them on a daily basis. I stop by my childhood home. And so I'm able to interact with people, but if not, this can become a very isolating career path.
It can be 100%. And then you combine all the emotional toll you have to take from everybody else. And it gets to be a very dark place. And I think that, I don't know, I have a feeling that this industry is going to clean itself up in the next couple of years. And I think a lot of it's based on what we're going to talk about today. Metabolic adaptation. I want to go ahead and get in this because I know you've probably got 40 bazillion things to cover and all the rabbit holes go down. But this, I think, is one of the most misunderstood things in the space right now, because you see the word damage being floated around, or like coach just being like, oh, that person's just fucked up. Like, I can't fix them and all that. And there's actual reasons behind it, and I know we've talked at length in person over this and through text and all that. And this is something that you really took a lot of time to understand, but not just hear from other coaches, but really dive into the research, really dive into the literature, and really pick those people's brains who were doing this stuff. We were very fortunate to have Dr. Campbell on last week. We shed a lot of light on some of the research he was doing, who was a brilliant brain. But I want to go ahead and get into this. And I think it's very, very simple. We begin with, what is metabolic adaptation?
Right. So fat loss and energy balance are simple concepts in theory, but can be much more complex and challenging when we try to apply them to both ourselves and then clients in the real world. And when we want to lose body fat and want to improve our body composition by getting leaner, we know we need to create an energy deficit by lowering the amount of calories we take in order to induce this deficit so that we're taking in less calories than we're burning. However, as we lose body fat and body weight, the amount of energy our bodies need reduces as well as, let's think about it. We're now lighter, leaner individuals. So it's natural that our energy expenditure goes down. Now, what metabolic adaptation refers to is the collection of physiological adaptations our body goes through in response to the changes in our energy intake and body composition, which results in a change in our energy expenditure. And here's the thing, most people, you hit on it, metabolic damage, people are broken, but most people only talk about metabolic adaptation as a negative thing. That comes when we diet. Yeah. But it's important to realize that it actually occurs in both directions. And this is what I see a lot of people neglect. So I do want to start with this as a caveat or a primer. So when we eat more calories and we gain muscle, or even when we just gain weight in general, our body responds by upregulating certain metabolic processes that increase our energy expenditure. Whereas when we go into a calorie deficit and we lose weight and we lose body fat, our body adapts by downregulating certain metabolic processes to conserve energy and decrease our calorie expenditure. So realize it goes in both ways. But often when people discuss metabolic adaptation during dieting, they focus solely on the reduction in metabolic rate. And that's why we hear these terms like a damaged metabolism, starvation mode, metabolic, I have a broken metabolism, all these different things relating to there's being damage to the system. However, that's really not what we see, because it's not just a reduction in metabolic rate that occurs as a result of losing weight, because that's only one piece of the physiological puzzle involved. And what we actually see in the research is something that's referred to as adaptive thermogenesis, which is one of the papers that I sent you. And this refers to the fact that we experience a larger drop in our energy expenditure than we'd expect purely based off of the total weight and body fat we've lost. So we do see a reduction in our basal metabolic rate from weight loss, but we also see other changes and downregulations that are even more substantial components of metabolic adaptation. But here's the thing, many people overlook these things. So these diet-induced adaptations will generally cause between an extra 5 to 15% reduction in the total calories burned per day than we'd expect, which is essentially a survival mechanism. We have to realize this is natural. This was put in place as like a stopgap from us losing too much weight, because evolutionarily speaking, if we continue to lose weight, it would put us in a place where we were in starvation. So realize no one is exempt from starvation. If you stop eating, you are going to starve. And so when people claim that there is a damaged metabolism or there's, starvation mode where people are gaining weight from being in such a long period of being in a deficit, that doesn't exist, guys. And so this is what makes dieting more difficult. So metabolic adaptation is a physiological process. This is natural. And this is part of why dieting, becomes more difficult the longer that you're in a cut. But it's also important to note that it does not halt the process of fat loss. It simply makes it so that we have to be more intelligent and strategic about our approach to overcoming these obstacles.
So I have a question for you then. Why do you think understanding metabolic adaptation is important? Like if I'm listening to this, and I think most coaches get it, but let's say we're just clients who are just listening, or anyone just out there trying to get better. Why do you think metabolic adaptation is a big point? I actually think it's one of the bigger ones people don't understand. So therefore they're always stuck in a fitness failure loop is what I call it over at, with Relentless. We call it like that fitness failure loop. They just don't understand how to kind of just get off of it per se.
This vicious cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
No, absolutely. So I believe it's important to understand metabolic adaptation and truly understand it from a physiological perspective, which is, we hear a lot of claims within this industry. We have a lot of people, they say things that come from a little bit of data, you know what I mean? But they misextrapolate the data. Maybe they misunderstand it, or what they do is, and unfortunately, they'll misapply it to fit their narrative. So they're trying to sell you something.
More of it. I think that's more of it.
So really, when it comes down to it, the reason I'm so passionate about talking about this and why I've studied it so heavily is that I believe it's important to understand this concept so that we realize that it can slow down the process of dropping body fat and cause us to need to drop calories or increase activity more to maintain our target rate of loss. But it's also an important concept to undertake and understand, so you realize that this isn't this insurmountable obstacle that will halt fat loss completely and permanently. The fact that our body has an adaptive response to being in a deficit is something that should honestly make inherently make sense to all of us who have completed a fat loss phase, as it's not like we can just make one adjustment to our intake or our activity at the beginning of a diet and just ride out that calorie intake for months on end and expect to continue losing the same amount of fat and weight week in and week out. Because if that was the case, let's think about it. If you just took and you reduce your calories by 500 calories, you put yourself in a 500 calorie deficit, you would lose a pound a week forever. So you'd eventually just starve to death if it was a result of that. So it's important to be aware of metabolic adaptation so that we can prepare for it, we can plan for it, and also so that we take a smarter approach towards fat loss phases, which mitigate some of the causes and effects of these natural adaptations, and also so that you can stop with these self-limiting beliefs. That's my biggest thing with this. I want to educate people to empower them. I don't want to scare them with this information. I always tell my clients, I always say an educated client is a compliant and adherent client. And the reason I say that is because they understand the process better. Listen, there's going to be obstacles along the way. There are going to be challenges. I'm currently in a dieting phase. I have a very adaptive metabolism, meaning that I downregulate energy expenditure very quickly upon entering a deficit. I know that about myself. I have hundreds of data sheets on my files on my computer where I've tracked out all my weight fluctuations throughout the course of different diets and different preps. And I know that if I don't stay on top of certain aspects of my energy expenditure, I will hit a plateau and I will not lose any more fat. What is initially a deficit for me easily becomes maintenance. So I have a very adaptive metabolism in that regard when dieting. And so having that awareness has allowed me to integrate different habits, different behaviors, and different strategies, not only into my lifestyle, but into my approach to dieting that allows me to be more effective. So this week, I actually posted a physique update, and I had so many people say, "Oh, it looks like it's easy for you to diet. You're changing quickly." You know what I mean? They think it's comfortable. No, I just know my body. I know the adjustments that need to be made, and I don't hesitate to make them because I know that I have to keep my need up. The reason I talk about things like NEAT and things like energy flux is because I've seen a drastic difference and an improvement in the results that I get when I started dialing in those things, when I started tracking my steps, when I started becoming more aware of my spontaneous activity, or rather, because I know I have an adaptive metabolism at this point, I realized that I was slouching on the couch more. I noticed that, even things that are subconscious that I wouldn't notice, but I would have people say, like, I remember I was at a presentation one year and I was on video camera. And a buddy of mine, I was giving a presentation of bodybuilding.com on supplementation. And he goes, "Dude, what happened to your eyes?" And I was like, "What do you mean what happened to my eyes?" I was in the middle of a dieting phase. I was hardly blinking. So these are subconscious things that you would never notice, but it's increased my awareness. Like, all right, well, I'm down regulating on other sides. I'm probably, not fidgeting as much. I'm not speaking with my hands as much. There's other things within the course of my day. Maybe my posture I'm not maintaining my posture as well. So I got to make sure my step count's at least up, or that I'm increasing my steps to make up for the down regulations in energy expenditure that naturally occur throughout the process of dieting for me.
Yeah, I'm similar to you in the fact that I have to kind of push food down a little bit and then push my activity up to get my body to do something. A lot of people are like, "Oh, it's easy for you." I'm like, "No, shit, I've been just doing this for like 27 years. I kind of like just know by now what my body needs to do to get it to fire."
The issue is a lot of people confuse efficiency and effectiveness of an approach that someone takes with easiness, with it being easy. I'm able to effectively and efficiently lose body fat because I know the levers to pull. However, it's not easy. I suffer. I just don't talk about the fact that I'm, ravenously hungry or that I'm really tired or any of these things. I had a conversation with one of my mentors this morning, and he said, you're cruising through this. And I said, "Joe, I'm not cruising through this at all. I'm suffering, but I embrace that suffering. And I like the struggle that comes along with this because it's an indication. When I'm hungry, I realize, yes, I should be hungry. This is a natural adaptation to dieting. I should be seeing an upregulation of my hunger hormones because I'm eating less food. When I feel tired, I know that it's a physiological adaptation where my body's trying to conserve energy. But then I have to say, all right, well, am I on track with my steps today? Have I made sure to, go on my post-meal walks? Am I, sitting more than I'm standing? Things like that. It's an awareness tool. So when you know things, when you have the knowledge, it's knowledge without application is meaningless and it's useless. However, when you're equipped with both the knowledge about a concept, especially like metabolic adaptation, you know what to do, and then you apply it to your life, it's so powerful.
Yeah, good old Joe Jeffrey, right? Is who you were talking to. Yeah, he's brilliant with some of the stuff he does. But yeah, I understand what you mean when people do that. Now, I want to move on because there's probably all different components we could get into about metabolic adaptation, but I think there's probably three main ones we should focus on. Three core takeaways that people could just instantly understand about this. So, what to you are the three main components? Because you know what, you've got thyroid, you got adrenals, you got leptin, you've got all these things you can just start crisscrossing and connecting with lines of paper.
We're going to do them all, my man.
All right, let's get into it then.
All right. So like you mentioned, there are three main components of our physiology that are impacted by metabolic adaptation. And these include a reduction in our total daily energy expenditure, hormonal changes, and mitochondrial changes. So I'll take the biggest one. So I like going after the big rocks first and foremost, because I think it's going to allow the audience to understand this a little bit better. So the first component of metabolic adaptation that we experience when we enter an energy deficit is a decrease in the total amount of calories we burn per day due to the fact that we're now eating less. So we burn less as a result, but this happens in all four aspects of our total daily energy expenditure, which we covered in our What Metabolism Really Means episode. So guys, if you haven't listened to that episode, we took a deep dive into all the facets and components of metabolism, because a lot of times when people speak about metabolism, what they're really confusing that with is your metabolic rate. Yes, that is a component of your metabolism, your total daily energy expenditure, but it's only one of four. So we want you guys to go back, listen to it. We went through an hour-long, podcast on that concept. So if you guys haven't listened to that, I would definitely suggest that. But the first part of our total daily energy expenditure that's down-regulated during a diet is the thermic effect of feeding, which goes down the first day that you go into a deficit. This is due to the fact that when we reduce our calorie intake, our body now has less food to assimilate and metabolize, so there's less energy being put into the process of digestion. So say you decide to reduce your calorie intake by 400 calories. Well, from the first day of your diet, you're now going to be burning 40 less calories per day as a result of lowering the amount of food you're taking in, which lowers your thermic effect of feeding. And like we covered in that previous episode, the thermic effect of feeding accounts for about 10% of our total daily energy expenditure. So you reduce calories by 400, now automatically you lost 10% of that. So now that deficit that was initially 400 calories is really 360 calories. So that's the first part of, a down regulation that we see. The next component that lowers is our resting metabolic rate. And resting metabolic rate lowers when we start losing weight during a diet, as we're losing body mass, which is metabolically active tissue that burns calories in and of itself. And we're essentially becoming a lighter, leaner individual. So the amount of energy it takes to keep the light on is now lowered. But whenever the topic of metabolic adaptation or adaptive thermogenesis, as some people will put it, during dieting comes up, I notice that most people worry the most about their metabolic rate dropping as a result of dieting. However, it doesn't drop nearly as much as many think or expect. It is the aspect of our energy expenditure which is the most out of our control. So what I always try to do when I educate clients about this concept, or I speak about metabolic adaptation, is to get people to realize that this isn't where their focus should be, because there are so many other aspects of our total daily energy expenditure that get down regulated even more, which they do have more control over, such as their NEAT levels. And we have research from Rosenbaum's lab, which I actually sent over to you, Jeff, which has specifically looked at the different aspects of our total daily energy expenditure that gets reduced during a diet. And they have found that when individuals lose at least 10% of their body weight, their RMR was reduced by only 100 calories. So they lost 10%. So these were heavy individuals. They lost 30 or more pounds. And there are other studies that look at even more extreme amounts of weight loss, up to 25% of total body weight. So keep that in mind, guys. If someone was 200 pounds, they lost 25% of their body weight, that would be 50 pounds. And this is a lot more than most individuals that are listening to this podcast are realistically going to lose during a fat loss phase. But even in those instances of extreme weight loss, they've only seen reductions of 100 to 150 calories from resting metabolic rate. And then in another study by Weigel, where participants lost 23% of their body weight, their RMR was only 2 to 3% lower than it was expected to be. So this isn't a drastic decrease. We see on average in most of the metabolic adaptation research that isn't extreme, that most times our metabolic rate only drops by about 50 to 70 calories. So this is like, not even an apple. You know what I mean? That you would have to eat less per day to make up for the drop in metabolic rate. However, this is what everyone talks about. Everyone always goes to the fact that, hey, my metabolic rate is damaged. I have a suppressed metabolic rate. But here's the thing, guys. We have research that looks at how much can our metabolic rate lower. And in 2016, Rosenbaum and Leibel actually did a study to see the limit to how much resting metabolic rate can reduce, as our body can only slow its resting metabolic rate so much, as this is the energy that we need to survive. And in this metabolic ward study, they took both obese males and females and put them through 3 conditions. So first, what they did was they found their maintenance calories and then put them into a maintenance phase to stabilize their weight for 2 weeks. And then they put them on an extreme diet. So this was an 800 calorie per day liquid diet until they lost 10% of their body weight. So keep in mind, they went into, not only did they take and they had them lose 10% of their body weight, which is a significant amount of body weight, but they also put them on an extremely aggressive deficit. So those are 2 reasons as to why they would suffer with more metabolic adaptation. After losing 10% of their body weight, they kept them at that weight for 2 weeks to study the effects that amount of weight loss would have on them. And then they had them drop another 10% of body weight and stay there for 2 weeks. So throughout the course of the study, they had them drop to 20% below their starting body weight. And in order to see the differences at each weight, they measured their total daily energy expenditure, their resting metabolic rate, and their energy expenditure from NEAT in the maintenance phase. Then once they had lost 10% of their body weight and stabilized, and then again at 20% of body weight loss. And when they looked at their resting metabolic rate, they saw that it decreased after they had lost 10% of their body weight, but it didn't go down any further at 20% of weight loss, which shows that there's a limit as to how much our resting metabolic rate can lower with weight loss. And we can't break our metabolism like so many people will make it seem, you know what I mean? And this should make sense because our RMR, or our resting metabolic rate, is the energy we need at rest and to stay alive. So it can't just keep declining more and more as we lose weight. However, when they looked at their total daily energy expenditure from NEAT, it continued to decline lower and lower the more weight they lost. So at 20% of weight loss, all the extra energy expenditure down regulations they saw was from the NEAT component, and it was significantly larger. It was a significantly larger reduction in the total amount of calories they burned per day than when they were at 10% weight loss. So the more weight that we lose, the more we see a decrease in energy expenditure, but that comes from NEAT, not from our resting metabolic rate. And
yeah.
So it's really important to realize that.
I was going to say my prep last year proved that. Like, if people who followed along with me saw that I literally didn't touch my food the entire prep, and all I did was keep my steps. I started at 12,000, then I went to 13,000. I was at 14,000. By the end of it, I was around 15,000 a day. I didn't touch my food till the last 10 days, which I dropped 60 grams carbs. And that was just to make weight. And I do agree with that 100%, where when people go into these dieting phases, they go into them so extreme that the first thing they do is they sit down on the couch all the time. And they're like, oh, my metabolism adapted. I'm like, no, you just became a lazy ass. Like, you know what I mean? And I think that's just, you and I have been through the dark side of preps. We've had the preps where it's been like tilapia and asparagus, 6 meals a day and 3 hours of cardio. And it's just like,
and that was the norm.
I was talking
to Jace Lopez about this yesterday, how back in the day when we used to prep, it was you put up or shut up. You don't complain,
suffer and die, or get out.
Nowadays, people are always complaining about how hungry they are, or this or that. And guys, realize this is a part of the process. And I'm not saying that there aren't strategies that we could use and we should use to mitigate some of these negative adaptations to dieting. However, these are par for the course. If you get lean enough, you're going to suffer with some of these adaptations. However, realize that you're not breaking your metabolism. You're not damaging your metabolism, because think about it. If that was the case, guys like Jeff and I that have been through 15 plus preps, we'd have no metabolism. We'd never get lean again. However, I'm right now, I'm doing a photo shoot prep. Anyone can look at my Instagram and see that I'm fairly lean. You know what I mean? So
yeah, I stay lean as well. I get what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So the next component is our NEAT component. Now, when it comes to the NEAT component of our total daily energy expenditure, the reductions we see in this component account for approximately 85 to 90% of the down regulations we experience as a result of metabolic adaptation. So when we see down regulations in energy expenditure, 85 to 90% of those come from NEAT, and that is why I'm such a proponent in NEAT. And we have research that shows that your total daily energy expenditure can drop by up to 400 to over 500 calories a day just due to the impact weight loss can have on NEAT levels. So say you were looking at a 1 pound lost per week, if you're someone who has a thrifty or adaptive metabolism like myself, and you don't pay attention to keeping your NEAT levels up, whereas I do, you can essentially erase most of the deficit you're trying to create due to this reduction in NEAT. And for example, there's a study by Rosenbaum that looked at how much of a reduction in total daily energy expenditure dieters who had lost at least 10% of their body weight sustained. And what they saw was that the average decrease in the amount of calories they burned per day was a 500 calorie reduction. So what they did was the researchers broke down this amount of metabolic adaptation and these down regulations into multiple components to see what aspects of the dieter's total daily energy expenditure were impacted most from the process of losing weight. And what they found was those who had lost 10% of their body weight saw about 100 calorie reduction in their RMR. So this matches up with some of the other literature that I went over previously about reductions in resting metabolic rate. However, when they analyzed the rest of the components that contributed to the largest degree of metabolic adaptation, they found that the physical activity energy expenditure had decreased by around 400 calories per day. So this is all in the NEAT component because they had these people in a metabolic ward, so realized they weren't doing intentional exercise. So all their physical activity energy expenditure, that's generally made up of your NEAT and your EAT, which is your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and your exercise activity thermogenesis. This was all made of NEAT. So the reductions we see in NEAT is one of the main reasons as to why people think the whole concept of calories in versus calories out doesn't work, as they think they're in a deficit based off of what some online calorie calculator or estimation equation told them should be a deficit, but at times they stall on fat loss on a calorie amount which they perceive as this meaning that there's that energy balance doesn't work. But what it really means is that they're no longer in a deficit, as the amount of calories they're taking in is now their maintenance calorie intake rather than a deficit. And this is one of the reasons why the first concepts or the first topics that we covered on this podcast was why you guys shouldn't use a calorie calculator, because they can be so, we see estimation errors between 400 and 700 calories per day. So say that you got an estimation equation and it said that your maintenance calories were 550 calories higher than what your maintenance actually was. If you go on a 500 calorie deficit, or what you think is a 500 calorie deficit, you're going to be eating at maintenance. So it's like logical, but because we put our faith into these estimation equations or into these online gurus, we believe what they say. And then we create this self-limiting or self-fulfilling prophecy where we think something's wrong. We either think, calories in, calories out doesn't work, or metabolism's broken. And that's just a self-limiting belief that is going to impact the rest of your dieting attempts, because our psychology impacts our physiology. And now when it comes down to the last component of our total daily energy expenditure that's down regulated from dieting, our exercise activity thermogenesis is down regulated during a diet as we experience a decrease in the amount of calories burned during exercise. And this is due to a lowered powered output. So this should make sense to most of us. Like if you've ever been in a rough diet or in a prep, you'll notice that you can't lift with the same intensity or even the same loads. And often you can't even handle the same amount of training volume during a cutting phase. And there's also research that shows that we can experience a 20% increase in skeletal muscle work efficiency, which basically means our muscles expend less energy to do the same amount of work, meaning we become more efficient and conserve more energy when moving and exercise, both in terms of our weight training and cardio, but even day to day. So like Jeff mentioned previously, he increases NEAT throughout the course of the diet. It wasn't just to make up for the reductions in NEAT, but it's also because for the same amount of NEAT, say that you kept it constant, you're burning less calories because you are a lighter individual, and we have an increase in skeletal muscle work efficiency. So say you had a baseline step count of 10,000 steps. If you were to keep that throughout the course of your diet while your body's down regulating its energy expenditure, that 10,000 steps would actually burn less 8 to 12 weeks into a diet than it did at the beginning. So you would actually be still reducing calories. And that's where increasing NEAT is highly beneficial, because it's helping to make up for those reductions. And so those are the aspects of our total daily energy expenditure that are impacted due to metabolic adaptation.
All right. Now, I know we've covered some of the energy expenditure, but do we want to cover more about the energy expenditure changes, or do you feel like we got on that pretty well and want to move on to hormonal changes?
Go to hormones, my man.
All right. Now, I know we've talked about, you have all the sexy buzzwords in the industry: hypothyroid, hypoadrenal, the plague that attacks you from wherever. But we have a lot of hormonal stuff. It was very interesting in the studies you sent me. A lot of it revolves around leptin from what they were talking about. So let's go ahead and get into that. Yeah, go ahead and get into that. Yeah.
All right. So the next aspect of our physiology that we're going to cover, and that's impacted by metabolic adaptation, are our hormones, which include our hunger and our sex hormones. So when we enter an energy deficit, our calorie expenditure exceeds our calorie intake, which causes our body to use more of its stored energy for fuel. So as we get deeper into a diet, we're liberating and burning more energy or more fat for energy. So our body fat lowers and our fat cells shrink, which is exactly what we're trying to accomplish from a body composition perspective. But this also comes with a decrease in our leptin levels, as leptin is mainly produced from our fat tissue. So the first hormonal change or adaptation that occurs during a diet is a decrease in leptin. And the leptin is essentially a hormone that acts as our main metabolic regulator and influences both our appetite and our satiety, as well as our energy expenditure levels. And it's pretty much the most influential hormone involved in metabolic adaptations. So just to understand leptin a little bit better, leptin levels are controlled by two primary factors. It's the size of our fat cells, as leptin is secreted by our fat tissue, and then what's called the short-term energy status, which is essentially the amount of calories that we're taking in on a daily basis. So our energy flux in the cell, essentially. Now, the thing with leptin is it plays a major role as a feedback and signaling mechanism to the hypothalamus, which is our control center in the brain. And when leptin levels are high, it signals that we have, multiple things. It signals that we have a sufficient amount of energy. It allows for satiety, normal levels of appetite, and activity. It allows us to have regular energy expenditure, and it also helps with our hormone production. This is all a signaling mechanism. Remember, the body's a feedback loop. But when leptin levels significantly lower, it starts sending less of a signal to the brain, and this is received by the hypothalamus as a sign of low energy availability. So now our body looks to slow down its metabolic processes to conserve energy. So as leptin levels go down, the hypothalamus picks up on this and starts a cascade of metabolic adaptations to conserve energy and slow weight loss down, because it perceives this as like a threat. So what's interesting is that when leptin decreases, it kicks off the signal to the hypothalamus to start metabolic adaptation. And it's from the hypothalamus that we see changes in various aspects that we've been covering today, such as a downregulation in total daily energy expenditure, a change in hunger hormones, change in sex hormones, different issues with metabolic hormones, and then mitochondrial changes. Now, when it comes to metabolic adaptation, the impact on hormones, I think, is most significant and is going to be the one that most people can relate to, having experience, are the changes we see in the hunger and satiety hormones. So with the hunger hormones, when it comes to our hunger hormones, there's a variety of different types of hormones that are impacted as a result of being in a deficit. And this should make inherent sense to anyone out there that's dieted. You get hungry during a diet. And often first of all, hunger is like the worst thing to deal with and what most people struggle with, but it is an indication that you are in an energy deficit. So when you are losing body fat, this is a natural physiological process and a natural adaptation that happens to the process of dieting. And this is primarily because leptin is a satiety hormone. So as we lose body fat and our leptin levels decrease, it skews our satiety signals and also causes a rise in ghrelin, which is our main hunger hormone, which increases our appetite and our drive to eat, which is why anyone who has dieted will know that they've felt hungry during a diet, especially as they've gotten leaner. So the leaner and leaner you get, especially if you get into like contest condition, you'll notice that you're ravenously hungry. Now with this, we also see that during and after weight loss, gut satiety hormones like GLP-1 and CCK are inhibited, which don't allow for appropriate fullness signals to be sent to the brain. And so this is why, anyone that's finished a diet, they've went out for a meal after, you could have a large meal, you could have a free meal, and you could have eaten until you feel physically full, but you still want to continue to eat. And it's because your fullness signals have been interrupted and dysregulated. And when dieting to low levels of body fat, we see hormonal changes and adaptations to our body, as reproduction isn't seen as essential or helpful during this time period. So when men and women get very lean, we'll see reductions in testosterone in men, and that'll also usually come with like a lowering of libido. And then we also see reductions in estrogen and disruptions in the menstrual cycle in females. And we'll also see reductions in insulin levels, which result in an increase in insulin sensitivity, but also those lower our IGF-1 levels. So we don't get a conversion of insulin into IGF-1. And then the last one, which Jeff kind of hit on previously, was we see thyroid production decrease. So generally what we see in most of the literature is that we'll see TSH will rise to signal that we need more thyroid, but our conversion of T4 to the metabolically active T3 will be interrupted due to the stress of being in a calorie deficit, which causes more of a conversion to reverse T3, which is an inactive form of thyroid, which doesn't help our metabolic rate and energy expenditure. So that's something, anyone that's a coach, I get blood work with a lot of my clients after a diet. I'll notice that they have lower T3 and higher reverse T3. And Jeff, I'm sure you've seen that as well.
Oh, dude, you'll see like 2.0 T3 and like reverse T3, 21, 22. You'll
Absolutely.
see. And, it's funny because a lot of people go to their doctor and they'll be like, well, my doctor said my thyroid's fine. I'm like, well, TSH and T4, I've never seen those really disturbed.
It's funny. A lot of times it will be subclinical hypothyroidism. So we'll just see disruptions in T3 and reverse T3, but we won't see it in TSH. But there are some research studies that do show an increase in TSH because the thyroid is trying to send more of a signal to release more of the thyroid hormones. But it's really hit or miss depending on how lean does someone get, how stressed are they during the diet. There's so many other factors besides just the calorie deficit in and of itself. I generally see when I have someone that is in contest prep, moving, they just got a new job, whatever these things, it's a compounding situation. I'll see more of the increase in reverse T3. Whereas if I have someone that they've gotten lean, but it's like a lifestyle lean, I won't see all these interruptions and perturbations in these these hormones.
Yeah. That's like we probably need to bring someone on to like have like a good talk about that, because I think it would just be neat to like just get almost a doctor involved, but I've seen some of that as well. Is there anything else you want to talk about on that?
Yeah. So the last hormone I would hit on, just because we are talking about stress and we were just talking about reverse T3, is we do see an increase sometimes in stress hormones. And the main one being cortisol. So being in a state of low energy availability is perceived as a stressor to the body, which can cause an increase in cortisol. And when cortisol is chronically elevated and stress isn't managed well, it can downregulate the production of other sex and metabolic hormones like testosterone and thyroid. And also we see that leptin and cortisol have counter regulatory effects on one another. So we already know that leptin's lower during a diet because we're losing body fat. But if you're chronically stressed and you're not managing your stress well, you will actually reduce leptin even more. And we actually see that in trials where people are in energy balance. So they're at maintenance calories or in a surplus, and they have chronic sleep restriction, which increases cortisol levels. We'll actually see a decrease in leptin and an increase in ghrelin. And that's in a state where they're fully fed. So imagine if we compound that with a lack of sleep during dieting, an energy deficit, low body fat levels, we have a compounding issue where we're having downregulations in leptin in 3 different aspects. So we're adding insult to injury.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Now, I do have a question for you. Do you think that the low T phenomenon that we're seeing among men and women is associated a lot with metabolic adaptation? Because majority of people now are like yo-yo dieters, you know what I mean?
Okay. I don't actually. So we actually have literature that we just had a meta-analysis come out by Smith in 2022. This was about 6 months ago, that it actually looks at the differences. So I want to make this clear, and we're going to go over this at the end. However, not everyone suffers from metabolic adaptation. This is something that a lot of people don't hit on. They kind of make it like this, and I'm guilty of this as well. I've never said that everyone will suffer from metabolic adaptation, but sometimes I've educated so heavily on the adaptation perspective that sometimes I haven't hit on the fact that this is individualistic. This is person dependent, and it's dependent on the level of body fat that you get to, how large of an energy deficit that you create, how long you stay in a dieting scenario, what your starting level of body fat percentage is. So we actually see in dieting cases that those at higher levels of body fat will actually have an increase in testosterone production, males. So if they're going from an overweight category, they have excess adipose tissue, they'll actually see an increase in testosterone when dieting and when losing body fat, because now they have less adipose tissue. So they have less of a likelihood to aromatize testosterone into estrogen, because we know that aromatase, the main enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen, is in adipose tissue. It's secreted by fat tissue. So that's the first thing. We actually see an improvement in hormonal markers in those that are overweight or obese. So in those populations, they would actually increase and improve their testosterone levels and their hormonal profile if they went into an energy deficit and lost body fat. The second thing is we only really see a perturbation or a real disruption to the HPTA axis in men for a testosterone perspective when getting to very low levels of body fat. So unless you're going beyond, you know, in most of the case study literature on bodybuilders, it's under 10% of body fat that we start seeing lowering of testosterone and that low T phenomenon. However, in all these bodybuilding case studies that we have, and I believe we have 6 or 7, within 3 months of having gotten back to energy balance, so going back to maintenance calories, their testosterone levels have returned back to the baseline that it started at. So this isn't a low T phenomenon where they're actually becoming hypogonadal because of diet.
Yeah. Dude, you know what we need to do? You need to post that show notes and tag in that, because I think that'd be a cool study to put out there, because most people assume when they get the metabolic adaptation, things start down regulating, that you'll see that with the testosterone. I actually think there's other things behind it, like a whole kit and caboodle, but I appreciate you breaking that down real quick.
And honestly, there's a study by Mueller from a few years ago where he looked at he did a review. So a review is very similar to a meta-analysis. It's a study of studies. However, they don't do an actual statistical analysis of it. So he did a research review on it. And he showed that only 60% of people in dieting trials, and now this isn't all the dieting trials that we have. However, in 60% of the dieting trials that he analyzed, only 60% of people actually suffered from metabolic adaptation. So I want this to be very apparent. We're going to go through, what impacts the degree of metabolic adaptation that someone experiences, but this isn't like an inevitable thing. This is if you get lean enough, if you lose enough body weight, or if you go into a very aggressive deficit, you will incur some of these adaptations. But this isn't like par for the course where everyone's going to experience these things. And that's why when I went over the hormones, I started with hunger hormones, because if you lose body fat, you are going to lose leptin, whether you're overweight or not. And actually, what's conversely interesting is that in overweight individuals that have excess body fat, they actually see a lowering of leptin. And you would think that's bad because now, they're suffering from hunger, but actually because they have excess leptin to begin with. So think about it. The more body fat you have, there's about a 0.85 correlation with body fat and leptin, meaning that body fat explains about 73% of the leptin levels that we have. With that being said, those that are overweight and obese, they actually have excess leptin, and they had what's called leptin resistance. So think about it in the concept of insulin resistance. We have too much circulating insulin, so our body becomes less receptive to the signal that it's sending. So remember, leptin is a satiety hormone. So with overweight individuals, you would think that because they have more leptin, that they would be less hungry, because they're secreting more of this, but their brain, their hypothalamus, is resistant to the signal that leptin is sending. However, we see in dieting trials that it actually increases leptin sensitivity. So it's a benefit. We can actually help, overweight and obese individuals to improve their leptin sensitivity by having them lose body weight and body fat. So remember, there's all these different sides of the coin. Some of these adaptations, when you get really lean, like contest lean, you're going to suffer more of the negative side of these adaptations. Or if you lose a very large amount of body weight, if you're someone that is 300 pounds and you lose, 25% of your body weight, you're going to suffer more of these metabolic adaptations because you just lost 75 pounds. That's a very large percentage of body weight. However, this doesn't apply to everyone. If you're just trying to get lifestyle lean, losing body fat is one of the healthiest things that you could do. We see improvements in insulin sensitivity. We see improvements in fasting glucose, fasting insulin levels. We see improvements in lowering in blood pressure, in resting heart rate, in autonomic, markers. We see, lowering of cholesterol values. We see an increase or a decrease in LDL and an increase in HDL. We see a decrease in triglycerides. We see, there's a multitude of effects. And honestly, losing body fat to a healthy range is probably one of the healthiest things that we could do. So yes, there are these metabolic adaptations, but there are also positive adaptations. So I don't want everyone to just think of the negatives in this. I just want them to be aware of some of the possible things that could happen with dieting, just to be aware of them and to take a better course of action.
I agree with that. And I think that knowing what the good and the bad in any situation you do is always beneficial to understand the length, the time, all that stuff you're trying to investigate. We are running up on our hour, but we have 2 more to go. So I'm going to let you slide into the mitochondrial changes, which is like the biggest thing to me, because I was reading about it. I was like, because you see a lot of like weird things being done out there right now to enhance and all these things for the mitochondria. And I'm like, all right. So I'm interested to see how mitochondria is impacted by the metabolic adaptation, how you've framed it out and educated people on it over the years.
Yeah, so the last part of metabolic adaptation is mitochondrial efficiency. And honestly, this is the least important part, to be honest with you. Because when you diet, our body looks for ways to become more efficient. And we know that. So it wants to become more efficient so it could burn less calories as we're taking in less energy. So it wants to conserve the energy that we are taking in to the best of its ability. And one of the main ways the body conserves energy during a fat loss diet is to increase mitochondrial efficiency. And sometimes when people hear that, they say, oh, we're becoming more efficient. That's not a good thing. It's almost, you know what I mean? Like we want to be almost like a gas guzzler in, car terms when we're, being able to burn energy. This is actually making us more efficient at burning energy. So we're burning less energy. And so increased mitochondrial efficiency is another component of metabolic adaptation, which is going to directly decrease our total daily energy expenditure. And this is because our mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, which work to create ATP, which is the energy currency of our cell. And we all learned that in science class back in high school.
We all should have learned that in science class.
I just go through it just in case. But this process is done mostly by breaking down fuel substrates like carbs and fats, which provide us the energy to create ATP. And usually within that process, we burn off some of the excess energy through heat or through thermogenesis. So it's an energy costly process. However, when we get really lean and when we lose our body fat stores and our calorie intake gets low, our mitochondria become more efficient. So we burn less calories through the process of creating ATP, which is our way for our body to conserve energy. So essentially, it's just putting a stopgap in the system. It's saying, let me burn off less energy in the process of creating energy. So we're getting less back in return. However, when we go into a surplus, our mitochondria realize that we have more energy in the system, and now it starts wasting more energy, which is why you'll notice, like if you overfeed, if you did like a protein overfeeding, you go to a rodizio in the off season, you'll be sweating through your clothes. That's both from the thermic effect of feeding, but also because your mitochondria are churning through energy substrates.
Yeah, no, you're right. The meat sweats whenever you go out. Oh, it's terrible. Like you can't, like I have to eat those places early and then go for like a walk and everything else, or I will sleep awful.
I always have to bring a second shirt. That's what I got to do.
Oh, Jesus. I don't know. It's that bad. All right.
I'm a sweater.
Yeah, I guess you are. Now, the last question, unless there's anything else you want to talk about mitochondrial changes, because I think that probably could be an episode in itself between what we know and what we've discussed and what we've chatted on in the past. We could probably do a deep dive on mitochondria, but is there anything else you want to bring on the topic of this in regards to metabolic adaptation?
Not in the context of this.
Is there any supplements that you can use to cheat it, to enhance it?
None that I'm aware of. There's obviously supplements to help and to enhance, our mitochondrial biogenesis, but that's not going to undo the effects of metabolic adaptation, except one thing that I'm not going to mention on air. And you already know what I'm talking about. So we'll move on from that one.
Fair enough. And then the last one, what influences how much metabolic adaptation we experience? Like, I know we've covered some different things, but I think it's best we just roll this up into a nice old blunt and smoke it to finish this one out.
Absolutely. So I really want to cover this because I do want to put it across that, yes, we do have these adaptations. They are good to be aware of, and we want to educate you in this process, but we don't want this to be like something that you dread or that you look to. I'm trying to empower people with the education that we provide them with. And so the amount in which each person adapts is completely individual, but it's mostly and heavily determined by a few factors. So the first is the magnitude of the weight loss. So this refers to the total amount of weight someone loses, as that will influence how much metabolic adaptation they experience. And this is for a variety of reasons. When we diet, our fat cells shrink and we lose body fat, which we all want. But having less fat mass lowers our leptin production, as leptin is secreted from our adipose tissue. So in most of the weight loss literature, we see a noticeable amount of metabolic adaptation in studies where they have people lose between 10 to 20% or more of their total body weight. So the more weight that someone loses during a diet, the more likely they are to experience metabolic adaptation, which is why, I work with my own clients on maintaining, a lot of the weight that they've lost. So they're no longer going through these yo-yo dieting cycles, because so many yo-yo dieters or so many cyclical dieters will go through these periods where they lose and then they regain the same 20 to 30 pounds every year. And with that, we see that chronic dieting not only predisposes someone to experience more metabolic adaptation when they do diet, but we also see in the literature that 1/3 to 2/3 of people who lose weight and gain it back actually gained back more weight than they lost in the first place. So now it's even harder to get off. So think about that. If you lost 30 pounds and you regained it, 33 to 66% of people that go through those cycles will actually regain more. So maybe they lost 30 pounds, but now they gained back 40, and now you have 40 pounds to lose. So now it's even a larger amount of fat that you have to lose off your body, and you're going to incur even more metabolic adaptation as a result because it's a larger amount of body weight. So the total amount of weight loss will be one of the biggest determining factors as to how much metabolic adaptation a person experiences. As someone who's lost 50 pounds and 20% of their body weight is going to most likely incur more metabolic adaptations than someone who's lost 10% of their body weight and it's only 20 pounds. And we see that in other cases in the literature, like in the Biggest Loser study, because they lost such a high proportion of their body weight. We're talking over 100 pounds on average. They experience a very large degree of metabolic adaptation. Now, the second degree that influences how much metabolic adaptation that you will experience is how lean you get. So the level of body fat that you get down to. And we have to realize that there's a massive difference between what someone's going to experience going down from, say, 20% to 15% or to like beach lean, as compared to going from 5 or 10% to 5% for a show. And we see that in the bodybuilding case studies, where a lot of these guys, they only started seeing drastic metabolic adaptations. Like most of the bodybuilding case studies, it's amazing. Most of these guys walk around 10.5 to 11% body fat.
Yeah.
And so they're very lean throughout the off season. They're not metabolically adapted. They don't have a depression RMR. They don't have lower total daily energy expenditure. They have normal testosterone levels. They're right within these are all natural guys that have been drug tested. And so they're all within physiological ranges for all their markers, their thyroid, their leptin, their ghrelin, all these, testosterone, estradiol. And then once they get to like the 6 to 7% mark, it starts taking a turn for the worse. So that's where we start seeing more metabolic adaptation. And generally in these case studies, we see them get to around 5% body fat on average. And that's where we really see the greatest degree of metabolic adaptation. But most won't notice the effects, especially from a hormonal perspective, until they get into what's considered essential body fat ranges. So that's going to be single digits for males and then between 10 to 15% for females. So there are some bodybuilding case studies for females where they're under 12% body fat, and that's where we really start seeing loss of menstrual cycle function, a downregulation of estradiol. We start seeing the female athlete triad, things like that. And then the last component of metabolic adaptation, or that determines the degree of metabolic adaptation that someone experiences, is the depth and duration of the energy deficit. So, the amount of metabolic adaptation that you experience will depend on how deep of a calorie deficit someone has created and how long that they've sustained it for. So when people go to the extremes during a diet and try to rush the process by starting off week 1 of their fat loss phase by slashing their calories in half, and guys, you might think that that's crazy. You're hearing it. I encounter males and females all the time that they show me what they're eating as compared to what they were, when they were at maintenance, and it's literally 50% of what they started out with. This is going to predispose you to experiencing these adaptations quicker as they induce a state of low energy availability quicker. So what we want to do is create a deficit that's both assertive and effective, but also one that a client can adhere to and isn't so large that it compromises their muscle retention and protein intake, as both muscle and protein intake will, lowering both of these or losing both of these will lower our resting metabolic rate and our energy expenditure levels. But with that being said, I do want to finish off this podcast by saying that I find a lot of people worry more about like this metabolic damage, which doesn't exist. And then there's others who know it doesn't exist, but that worry about metabolic adaptation when they don't need to. So overall, when we wrap this up in a bow, metabolic adaptation, most people are not going to experience a large degree of metabolic adaptation unless they have a lot of weight to lose or they get to very low levels of body fat, like in the case of a competitor. And that's really what I want to reinforce. Like, we wanted to give you guys the information about this, but it's important to point out that not everyone experiences everything that we spoke about. And a lot of people don't. And so you don't need to worry about these things. You just have to realize that these are things that could come with the process. They're good to be aware of. And it's also good to put certain awareness tools in there. Keep your need up. Make sure you keep your protein intake high. Try to sustain, maintain your resistance training stimulus throughout the course of your diet so you maintain muscle mass. And know that there are certain stopgaps in the system which could cause stalls. And instead of getting frustrating and thinking something's wrong, just double down, recalibrate things, do an energy audit where you really look at your energy intake, reassess things, make an adjustment, stay consistent with it, and then go from there.
I want to say this for anyone who's listening, that Biggest Loser study is probably the most eye-opening study you will ever look at and like really read, as far as just applicable to the majority of people who walk around, as we've discussed before on the podcast, because the rate of failure of that was what, north of 68%. It was like 68, 70%.
Which Biggest Loser study you're talking about? There's three.
Well, I want to say the one I read had like a 68% failure rate, meaning all the people went right back to where they were or gained back.
So what we see in the large meta-analysis on weight loss studies, and this is the unfortunate part, at 1 year after weight loss trials, we see 70 to 80% of people regain all the weight that they lost. At 2 years, we see 85% of people go back to their starting weight. And at 3 years, we see 95% of people go back to where they were. Of all those people that have regained their weight within the first 1 to 3 years after a diet, we see that 1/3 to 2/3 of those individuals have regained more than actually what they initially lost. So now they're heavier than they started the diet to begin with previously. And so we don't have a dieting problem. Diets work. 6 out of 7 people that go on a diet will lose a significant amount of body weight throughout the course of their life. So they go on a diet, it's effective. Even if you look at the weight loss registry, which is the largest conglomerate of successful weight loss dieters, 98% of them went on a diet. So, we're talking about the vast majority of them went on a planned diet. It wasn't spontaneous. They had a course of action, they had a plan of action, and they executed on it. However, what we do have is a weight maintenance issue. And that's really where it comes down to, having a strategic plan, both for the diet itself, for the active weight loss period itself, but then also for maintaining the results you had. And that's why I hit on the fact that I don't want my clients going through these weight loss and weight regain cycles. I really focus on the maintenance habits of after the diet, because then on their next, and it's not like, when I say weight maintenance, we have to realize that if you lose weight and say you were at your lowest body weight, say you got down to 200, you went from 230 to 200 pounds. Remember, when you are at the end of a diet, you are not only have you lost body fat, but you've also lost glycogen. You've lost the water associated with glycogen. So your real weight isn't what's on the scale at your lowest weigh-in. You have multiple pounds of glycogen, carbohydrate content within the muscle that you need to restore, and the water that comes along with that. So you're going to float. And actually, in most of the weight loss literature, they define weight maintenance as being between 2 to 3% of your dieting weight. Right. So if you were 200 pounds, floating up to 206 is within weight. You are weight stable. But some people, they see 1 pound increase in the scale and they freak out, not realizing they have more glycogen content. Their muscles are fuller. They have more water. They have more gut content. They have more, food in their GI tract, all these different things. And so what we have to realize, we really have to focus not only on the diet itself. That's an important component. You can mitigate a lot of these metabolic adaptations with the approach to dieting that you take, but also the way that we undo a lot of these metabolic adaptations is the way that you approach your post-dieting period. And that's both to mitigate the effects of these metabolic adaptations as well as to maintain the results that you got. And another thing is that, actually we need to do a whole episode on this, to be honest with you, like metabolism myths, metabolic damage. We'll go through that. We'll go through, a lot of people think that starvation mode or these metabolic adaptations are responsible for weight regain. And we don't see that in any part of the literature.
Yeah.
The adaptations you sustain. So these, what we talked about, these are all undone once you get to energy balance. So once you get back to maintenance calories, these no longer exist. So it pretty much undoes it. The only things we do see is we see a long lasting, when people maintain a large amount of weight loss, we do see a reduction in their non-exercise activity thermogenesis levels, because most people aren't aware of these things. But keep in mind, in most of this weight loss literature, they're not tracking steps. First of all, they're not engaging in resistance training. They're not eating high protein. So they already have 3 negatives against them.
Yep.
So they are more susceptible to these adaptations. Whereas in clients that we work with, we are making sure a lot of these boxes are checked. And I know I'm putting stop gaps in the system to mitigate all of these things.
B, I think that one was tight as hell, man. I think we did a good job on that. I know you've been itching and crawling and ready to get this one underway.
Horses, man.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's honestly, guys, this is something that I'm really passionate about. When I got into this industry, it was all about metabolic damage. You know what? We're going to do a whole episode on that next week to dispel some of the myths around metabolism. But this was something that was propagated and promoted by so many people. And it's one thing, you don't know what you don't know, but there are a lot of people in the know that are intelligent individuals that have successful businesses, but they sell something to fit a narrative. So what I try to do is I try to put out such good information that's evidence-backed and evidence-based that it makes you become a better critical thinker. I want to educate and empower you guys with the information that I present you, so you guys don't have this self-fulfilling prophecy where you avoid dieting because you think that you're automatically going to set yourself for weight regain, or that you're going to damage your metabolism, or that you're going to need a fix or a solution. There is none of this. There are smart approaches, and there's optimal approaches and suboptimal approaches, and one will leave you in a better place than the other. However, it's not like either way is going to cause you permanent damage. And that's what I really, Jeff and I are really passionate about, speaking out against coaches in this industry that, sell these narratives to clients where they need a solution, they need a fix, and they're the only coach that can do it for them. Because honestly, we're here to be a guide to you. We're here to be a leader for you. We're here to be a mentor to you, to provide you with empowerment through education, through guidance, and through our, both the what we've learned in the evidence, but as well as what we've learned in experience. But we're not here to sell you narratives that are going to make you feel belittled and feel like you have something wrong with you, because that isn't the case. And I would never, present that to a client.
Yeah, I think, like for me, I'm a lot of Gen Pop people always talk about that. Most of them just need help understanding like the weekend ropes and how they can like slip and fall there. And then a lot of people who have quote unquote the metabolic damage just had a lot of binges that drove a lot of things out of line, and they have a lot of things to reset. But
lack of awareness.
Damaged. Yeah, it's lack of awareness.
It's a lack of awareness. It's bad habits. Yep. And it's where we could work on habit change and behavior modification, and then some education on top of that. So they become more aware, they become more mindful, both in their habits, their behaviors, but also their mindset around all of these things. And so that's really where it comes down to. This is, being able to ingrain all these different habits, these behaviors within clients, and then also educating them throughout the process so that they learn, and that we dispel some of the myths, some of the misconceptions that they've heard or that they've read about that have limited their ability to really maximize their potential.
I agree with you. B, where can everybody find you?
Guys, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at @BrandonDeCruz_ or at my email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com.
You guys can find me, Jeff Unbreakable Black, on IG, relentlessforever.com, if you guys are interested in working with me. And by the way, real quick, I've got everyone's attention. You guys have done awesome with sharing us, tagging us, rating us on Spotify, rating us on iTunes. Keep that up. Me and B are going to find one or two people that we're going to cover your all's ticket to the PEC when we present again. So that way we can at least say thank you some way. We'll maybe do some other stuff, but we'll plan, but we can't say thank you enough for what you guys have really done to help us grow this. We really appreciate it. And until next week, where we talk about metabolic damage, we will check you all then. I hope you all have a good week. B, talk to you there, man.
All right, later, brother.
Bye.